So it's just interesting that you guys are opening, not just a barcade, because I mean that's such a
copyrighted word.
It's that too.
It's such a trademarked word.
The 80s were a time of excess. Everything was big, from the hair to the cell phones, and one of the biggest trends was the rise of the arcade. When Space Invaders hit Japan in 1978, it was so massive that it actually caused shortages in the 100-yen coin. Arcades popularized so many of the video game genres we know today: side-scrollers, shooters, fighting games. It was a communal experience with kids lying down their quarters and proclaiming, "I've got next." And although those old gaming palaces have mostly become a footnote in video game history, some unsung heroes have emerged and are starting to salvage discarded machines, setting up new spaces and drawing both older nostalgic gamers and a new generation ready to explore the classics. Tim Owens and Jim Groom were set to open Reclaim Arcade in spring of 2020, a date that would prove impossible due to the global pandemic raging out of control. But luckily, the duo have been able to postpone until 2021, when they plan to open up their location in Fredericksburg, Virginia. But that doesn't mean you need to be local to experience Reclaim Arcade. Tim and Jim are working to bring in a worldwide audience through the use of robots, webcam, and software that lets everyone relive the 80s virtually. The real question: am I using this video as an excuse to play some classic games? Does it even matter? Let's go talk to Tim and Jim and see what Reclaim's all about.
We bought our first cabinet 2.5 years ago, roughly, maybe.
I think so.
We bought a Centipede for our office. We were like, it'd be kind of fun to have like an old school arcade game in the office, and we got one. And then a couple months later, we got 4 more. And we just kind of we got on this kick where we were collecting. We were collectors and we were buying these games, putting them in the office, finding spots for them. And we kept joking, are we starting Reclaim Arcade? How many games does it take to be an arcade?
Well, I think when we went over 15 or 20 games.
Yeah, we had 12, and then I think at the 15
mark, it felt like an arcade. The Centipede, which was our first cabinet, was so, the cabinet itself was so gorgeous. The artwork was perfect. It was so clean, and it was like beautiful furniture, because a lot of the side cabinet art of some of those games is just beautiful. Galaxian, Pac-Man, Asteroid.
It was really about having the space, and then at that point, we had 15 to 20 games, and we decided let's start not just collecting, but building this thing.
Once we thought about the arcade, Tim was like, what if we put in a living room in the arcade so people can play Atari 2600, Atari 5200, NES, watch TV, Laserdisc, Beta. We have them all. And we have a VHS store so people can grab the VHS they want, sit on the couch, and just almost the fun of figuring out how the hell you run a VHS again. This should be a big laboratory, but also a resource for the local community to come and play, kind of like an archive, a living museum of games, but not treated like a museum. They're all usable. They're 40 years old, right? They're like me. They kind of can stand the test of time a little bit. I'm a little older than them, but they're doing better than me even.
I think people crave that sort of that social atmosphere in a way where you can come together around an idea, right? It's obviously got some baked in nostalgia with it, but it's also sort of we can have this shared experience together. We can play a game. We can walk up to Mortal Kombat or something else and play that. It's why pinball has gotten really popular, and there's pinball tournaments happening in different places and that kind of thing. And so I think that now more than ever, especially with COVID, I think people are craving how can I get those social experiences? How can I, where can I find places to be able to do stuff like that again?
This is another space that's a lot harder to reproduce, and I think you mentioned this earlier, in the virtual. Some of the holding on to a joystick and playing Pac-Man is very different than trying to do it on the keyboard. I mean, it's just split second, and it sounds crazy, and I love emulation. It's allowed me to keep playing them, but the physical monitor, the CRT, even when you watch the TVs on VHS, it's a different experience. It's a different aesthetic. It just literally is. And the ability to do it and see it and feel it is valuable, because it is a unique vision, like VHS is the horrible format, right? It's the worst of the worst, but it was accessible and it won out. But VHS on the right CRT with the right player has its own appeal, right? It kind of has its own sense.
Right.
And I just love that too, that there's something really tangible about the entire experience.
Tough game. Joust was one of the earlier ones that we got, and it became a favorite of mine. It was right behind my desk, and I would just walk up and got pretty good at it. I still have the high score on this cabinet. Also such an odd concept for a game, like Knights on Ostriches. Why not? The guy who designed it did not want to do another space game. There were so many space games out, from Defender to everything else, and so he was with Williams, and he came up with this concept, and it had all different types of controls. You would only be able to move left and right and flap the wings, and so it was a very different control set and a very different concept from all the space games that were very popular at the time. And they gave it a shot, and it got accolades. Like, people just loved the game.
You shoot people in the face a lot in this one, which is, no one really likes to talk about it, but they'll be coming up the elevator and then you'll be shooting them like in the face. It's, luckily the 8-bit graphics couldn't really, it didn't get to Mortal Kombat levels of blood. So there it is, I love the kick. And these guys, I like how they just appear from the rooms, because it does really give you a sense of continuity, like you're being chased in a movie, right, with all these people, and I love that. Sometimes you can jump and get in.
It's in many ways, it's a very accessible style of game because the controls are the same on pretty much all of them. You've got 2 flipper buttons, so it's accessible, but for the people who want to dig deep, you can go really deep into a lot of the rule sets on some of these games and really figure out all the ins and outs and figure out like how to really rack up the scores. But somebody can walk up to a pinball machine and they know how to play it. There's 2 flipper buttons and you flip them and the ball hits things, right? Yeah. So if you're just having fun and then it does things and things start moving and the ramp comes down and I'm hitting it into the Demogorgon, like that. So like there's a lot of real mechanical things that are really visually appealing, but the controls of it and everything else are really super accessible. And so I think that's why people like it a lot. That because of COVID, we're trying to think through how we might allow people to play things online that are physically in the space. And so we're actually going to hook cameras and motors up to this game so that people are going to be able to log in and play the pinball machine from the internet. So it's a website called Surrogate TV, and they allow you to log in and you can play a game. And so we'll have this online at certain times of the day and you can go in and play Avengers, but it's physically playing the machine. It has webcams pointed at the playfield and everything's hooked up in a way where you're actually playing a physical machine that lives somewhere else. And you can do it from anywhere in the world.
And that's a great way to bring especially with this being such a local business, to kind of broaden it out.
Exactly. To say like, what's Reclaim Arcade? Like, like where is that? Oh, okay, maybe they're like a state away or something. Maybe I'll try to play them next time in Virginia. So this is along with our idea of people being able to interact with the space if they can't actually come into it, is that they could be on a robot as long as they don't like overtake us, right? Like that's the danger.
I mean, this is the biggest middle finger to COVID right now.
Yeah.
Is you can't be in the space? Well, how about our robots?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we've got to embrace the constraints, right? So, like, exactly. that would be one of them is, like, how can we get people to experience it? And how can we, help them take advantage of it, if they can't actually be here. So, we'll see how that part pans out. So.
And hopefully they don't take over the
yeah, exactly.
The entire arcade.
Galaxian. That's cool because it's a reference Pac-Man is making to another Namco game, Midway game, Galaxian, which comes out I think as early as 1979. Pac-Man's 80, so Galaxian's a year older, which is crazy, I think. But Pac-Man fever was what it was all about. The second Galaxian was a relief, because you finally got, the ability to eat ghosts again, because it starts to get so fast that you lose that ability. But the second, I think there's a key like that too. But definitely the second Galaxian was like an oasis.
I've never actually, as many Pac-Man machines as I've seen, I've never seen a Pac-Man with a speed chip.
Yeah.
It's always Miss Pac-Man I run into.
Exactly. A lot of the 80s arcades were sleazy. I mean, it gets forgotten in this kind of cleaned up version of something like Reclaim Arcade, but they were sleazy. And so, New York City and Times Square, when we go to the arcades, they were like dens of iniquity. It was like going to the cantina in, Star Wars. It was like, oh, you're not going to Mos Eisley, are you? Not the key. I could hit 150.
I was telling him this is not the first time that you have created an 80s living room. So this exhibit is actually a recreation of something you did at the University of Mary Washington, right?
It is, yeah. So this is the second iteration of the living room.
That's what this space provides in some ways, is like, wow, I'm in my parents' or my living room, from when I was a childhood kid, and I can play Atari, and like, you can really, it's more than art, it's really a connection that's like really interesting, I think. For some people, the arcade's the draw, for others, this could be the draw,
exactly.
Right?
And you could program it so that just coming in and being in the living room and watching that is its own experience. Like, that's a thing. And then you can decide, nope, I want to put on a Laserdisc, or I want to put on a Selectavision.
There is a sense that it's almost like a museum, right? Like that nostalgia, and also like a sense of like a time capsule, but one that you can actually interact with. Like, it's that permission to sit down and watch a movie in the space that seems really exciting, to say like, it's not just that thing behind a glass wall and it's like, oh yes, that's the thing that we had at that time, or these are the arcade games that we used to play and here they are for you to look at. It's like, we want people to actually interact with the stuff and play it, play the movies, play the games, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's a really special kind of permission that allows people to say like, this stuff isn't just, objects for you to look on and say like artifacts. They're actually living things that you can continue to enjoy and to help remind you of a specific period of time, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's my favorite part. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's another thing from the 80s. I mean, that's another thing the 80s gave us, was the rise of the DIY movement.
Yeah.
And then that really started the democratization of creation, which has now led to YouTube and the user-generated content that we're seeing now. That was all born out of the 80s. And like you said, from the VHS.
For everyone, it's going to be different.
Right. For you, it's different, obviously. Yeah. So it is a return to a time and a space that has meaning for you, and it obviously wouldn't have meaning for your kids in the same way by any means, but I think it was absolutely a special time, and I don't think anybody, whether they were born in the 80s or not, wouldn't understand that like a lot of what we're talking about was an incredibly important time for that move, that democratization, as you're talking about, like that idea of moving the idea of control and the idea of creation from this corporate thing that you just consume to the idea that you could have it in your living room, that you could have it, that you could create it, all that kind of stuff, copy it, exactly, remix it, all those kind of things. That was all born out of that decade, that time period, which I think is really special. So
I agree.
Yeah.